What's up, everyone? This is Christy Drutman with Brown Girl Green, and today I want to talk to you about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, aka the biggest climate change report to have come out in recent history in the past 7 years. So maybe this is the first time you're even hearing that a report like this exists, or maybe you have been scrambling the headlines, scratching your head, going under the covers, crying yourself to sleep just like I have. Either way, I'm going to break it down. The bad, the ugly, but also the good and the hopeful that's in this report. So before you jump to the conclusion that, the world is ending and we're just all screwed, which, maybe in some ways you're not entirely wrong about that. But I want to challenge you on that and to tell you some of the facts that may make you, twist that a little bit and feel a little bit more optimistic. So first, I should probably explain who even made this report in the first place. So, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is an intergovernmental body of the United Nations that is responsible for providing the most up-to-date information when it comes to the environmental, political, and social factors and impacts that are going to happen due to the climate crisis. The IPCC assembles 234 scientists who are experts on climate science and earth science who are nominated by the member governments. So basically, all of these scientists who volunteered their time came together, read and assessed around 14,000 scientific research papers. So you and I didn't have to do that. And basically, they created this assessment report. This essentially reviews the latest and greatest on all things related to the climate crisis and climate science. So this report is the latest since 2013, as I mentioned before. I want to dive into what they exactly found. Obviously, you have to start with the bad news first. Everywhere in the news headlines, you're hearing that it's a code red for humanity. And while that seems pretty drastic, it's not entirely wrong. First, they found that carbon dioxide concentrations are currently higher than it's been in the last 2 million years. Not 2,000, 2 million years. AKA, more greenhouse gases are getting trapped and the planet is getting progressively hotter and hotter. So some context just to back it up. Back in 2015, countries all around the world came together and they came up with this thing called the Paris Agreement. That was an agreement that said that all the countries in the world decided that they wanted to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the world from warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was a great, ambitious goal, but this report is showing that we are on the trajectory to meet and even exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're going to exceed it. And they're saying that the only way that we could possibly be able to not have that reality happen is if the entire world went completely net zero. That basically means that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we are putting out in the atmosphere was equally getting sequestered or taken out of the atmosphere. So there is an even balance. But the current trajectory we're on, we are releasing way more greenhouse gas emissions than we are taking them out. So the planet is progressively getting warmer, and unless we actually wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and actually stop extracting resources at the rate that we are, it's pretty much impossible that we're not going to exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. Unless these corporations and fossil fuel companies choose to really take sincere action on the climate crisis, and every sector would need to shift to reduce its emissions. Unless all of that happens, we're going to see an increase of warming. We are going to see an increase in cyclones, floods, and other natural disasters like drought and heat waves, loss of biodiversity, increases in sea level rise, melting glaciers, other health issues like waterborne diseases, poor air quality, and so on. And I want to emphasize that specifically this is going to disproportionately impact and has impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as low-income communities who do not have the resources or support to be able to adapt and mitigate from the impacts of the climate crisis. And this is largely due to the fact that fossil fuel companies have been paying billions of dollars to try to convince the public that they are not evil. It also is due to leaders not taking action on the urgency of this crisis when they actually had the ability to avoid the worst impacts of it. And so we are in this mess because of government negligence and also industry corruption. And so, it's a party to contend with. So it's up to all of us to now think about what is the fight ahead of us. All right, But the good news, because I can't leave you just upset knowing that the world is in a whirlwind. The good news is that we have so much data now. We have so much data to show to politicians, to corporate leaders and sectors all over the world that they cannot deny this anymore, that there is a linear relationship between human-created emissions and the climate crisis. And so that's an important part of this report. They say that every degree, like 0.1 degree increase past the 1.5 degrees makes a huge difference. If we can limit that by reducing emissions dramatically, we are going to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. For instance, with sea level rise by 2100, sea level rise is projected to be around 0.1 meter lower with global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees Celsius, which could be the difference between island communities or communities that are going to be very vulnerable to sea level rise having enough time to adapt and mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis by having infrastructure and evacuation plans and et cetera, or not. Like, it's the difference between life or death for a lot of these communities. Or, when it comes to heat, at 2 degrees Celsius, we will see compound events such as deadly heat waves and killer droughts happening at the same time in the same location. Whereas 1.5 degrees Celsius, maybe we're gonna see a drought somewhere, a heat wave somewhere else, but they won't have that same compound effect as rapidly in the same geographic location. Again, this is about protecting the most vulnerable communities that are already on the trajectory for the worst impacts of warming. So now that we have all this data, I really want this to be a very clear call to action to humanity, to whoever watches this video. These are the things that need to be done. We need to have leaders around the world passing robust legislation that matches this robust data to actually regulate polluters in industry, especially the fossil fuel industry, to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, to be able to invest in jobs and infrastructure and a just transition that is going to actually benefit frontline communities of color most by creating healthier green spaces and opportunities for employment. And also, it's so important to recognize that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities all over the world have been dealing with the climate crisis far before this report has been released, far after this report's going to be released. So we need people who have power, privilege, access to support the fights that are going on the front lines, whether it be line 3, line 5, stopping oil fields in other countries. We need as many people as possible to not only donate money, but also to support their time, volunteer, amplify their work, and be able to share resources and opportunities. The last thing is shifting our culture to ultimately canceling the fossil fuel industry. We cancel all these celebrities, we cancel politicians, but where's the canceling of the fossil fuel industry, who has basically driven the majority of why we're in the mess we're in today? We need to shift to a culture where fossil fuels do not have a space here anymore, that this industry is not driving this crisis anymore. I hope that this is a wake-up call to so many people that not just that life is short, but that this time window to address the climate crisis is so short, and we need people to be present, to show up, and to support each other. There needs to be hope, and that we need to hold each other in that. I hope that this just gives you a sense that there is some certainty of what we can and cannot fight at this point, and that the amount that we can is so much that we can fight for, so much that we should fight for our families, for future generations. And I hope that this debrief just gave you a reality check, but also left you really inspired to take the next step.